Welcome to the Legal Navigator podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca from Law Training Centre, and today I'll be in conversation with Her Honour Judge Sarah Davies. Welcome, Judge. It's lovely to have you here with us today, and we're happy to be able to support you and the HMCTS in educating about the role of legal advisors and raise awareness on the ongoing recruitment campaign. We are also excited to be discussing about how you started your career as a legal advisor and are now a member of the Judiciary. So just looking into your history and appointments, you started as a legal advisor in 1981 and was called to the bar in 1984. You then became a fee-paid judge in the first tier tribunal in 2011, and then a district judge in 2013 and a circuit judge in 2017, and then appointed as the designated family judge for Kent in January 2023. First word that comes to mind is wow. This is truly commendable and very inspiring. So it would be great to find out more about your personal journey and what it's like working in the judiciary. So I'm going to start off by asking if you could give us a little more information about what your role as a judge involves.
I'm a family and court of protection judge. That means I hear, because I have a senior role, I hear more of the more serious cases. I deal a lot with non-accidental injury to babies and small children, sexual abuse, in fact, anything really horrible. I also deal with some private law, not very much, which are arguments obviously between parents about how their children are raised or who their children live with. I'm also a court of protection judge, and court of protection deals with people over the ages of 18 who do not have capacity to litigate or don't have capacity to decide where they want to live. So I deal with either with people with serious learning disabilities or perhaps older people who might have dementia. A typical example of that would be an older lady who had fallen over, was taken to hospital, was then unable to be sent home because she required more care, and is then put into a nursing home, and she is very unhappy and wants to go home. And so I decide where she should live. So with children cases, I do a lot of fact finding. So I don't have a jury, so I decide who's done it, so to speak. So last week I had a case where I had a baby with multiple fractures, and I've had to decide which parent out of the two of them has caused those fractures. It's not always easy to say. I don't have to strain to find the perpetrator, but I just have to come up with a decision as to whether the local authority have proved their case. So that's basically what I do. I also am in charge of all the Kent judges and family magistrates. So I have a role in managing them as well.
Very interesting, very diverse role indeed. How did you find the transition into becoming a judge? Like, how is it different to advocacy?
I think you have to be quiet and listen to people. Advocates are very good at talking. I never encourage barristers or advocates who are solicitors to talk too much. But as a judge, you have to sit back. It's sometimes very difficult to be quiet, but you have to train yourself to listen to everybody before you make a final decision. And that's the main difference, I think. And also you're making decisions about people, final decisions about people. You're not just representing somebody. So it is a very different role.
Right, so we would be keen to hear about your personal journey to becoming a family court judge. How do you think this compares with other judges, both in the family division and across the division more broadly?
I didn't come from a traditional background. My father left school when he was 14. My mother left school when she was 16. They were both very clear because of their own personal circumstances, because my father had been evacuated, as had my mother, and his mother had wanted him home when he was 14, and he'd been at grammar school, and he was desperate to stay on in education, but his mother wanted him back to start work, and he had to do as she said. And my mother had also missed out on a lot of schooling because my grandfather was a prisoner of war for 5 years. And so even though she had won a scholarship to, I think, Putney High School, she was kept at home to look after the other 5 children because my grandmother's army pay was stopped because they didn't know where my grandfather was for a year, because he was in prisoner of war camp the other side of Poland. So my parents were both very keen on education. Our local grammar school, I went to an ordinary state primary school. Our local grammar school didn't believe in girls going to university. So my mother became a governor to try and change it, but she knew that it wouldn't be within my time scale. And so she applied for all of us for scholarships to private schools. And I got a 100% scholarship to a boarding school. Everybody was very nice to me. My father had had a very serious head injury and hadn't worked for 5 years. So I must be one of the few judges who have been on benefits. And I had free school meals at school. So I know all about that. So I didn't come from a traditional background. For the kind of people that became barristers when I was that age, all had private incomes because you didn't get paid really for a year virtually. There was no funding to do pupillage. And so when I finished a law degree at University of Kent, I wanted to become a barrister. But the careers advisor said to me, this is entirely hopeless. You don't know anyone, you don't have any money, you don't have the right connections, and you're a woman, because they really did at that stage discriminate against women. And most chambers either had no women in them or one woman. And so I'd be told lots of times, oh, well, we've got our woman, we don't need any more. So it was a very difficult time. So I went and worked for a firm in Canterbury doing probate and conveyancing. And I did that for 3 months. And I found that quite boring, because all my clients were either dead or moving. So I never really saw anyone. I went back to the careers advisor and said, look, I want to be a barrister. And she said, no, you're mad, you can't possibly do it. And I said to her, well, there must be a more interesting job I can do. And she said, well, go and be a legal advisor. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, you give legal advice to magistrates, because magistrates are volunteers. They're people who don't have any formal legal training, although they have some training. And you would advise them in terms of criminal work and family work about the law. And she said, it's a very interesting job. You get to go to court every day. There's a bit of admin, but you see a lot of different cases, and it's an extremely interesting role. And I thought that sounded good. And I said to her, well, how do I do that? And she said, well, write to all the courts in the country, because I don't think they were advertising then. And I was offered 3 jobs, and I'd never been to Birmingham before, but I took the job there, and I became a trainee legal advisor. I was told that I would be sent to bar school if I wanted to do my bar exams, and I thought that would be great. But then I was told I'd have to wait 5 years, because there were people in front of me who were waiting to go to bar school, and I was only paid £4,500. And I knew if I could pass my bar exams, my income would double overnight. So I wrote to the Bar Council and said to them, can I just do my bar exams borrowing somebody's notes who did the course the year before? Because we didn't have any online or correspondence courses at that stage. And they said, we don't recommend it, but if you really want to, you can never practice, but of course you can. So I simply borrowed somebody's notes, worked very hard whilst I was working. I had to take holiday to revise and also holiday for my exams. So I just had half days working, because you can't revise all day. And I worked from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. every night in the library. I started off doing a couple of hours a night, sort of, I think, in the September, and I worked at weekends as well. And I took my exams. So I did very well. I got them. I then remained a legal advisor. And I should also say that after 3 months as a legal advisor, I was asked if I wanted to leave. And I was a bit surprised by that. And I said, well, why? Why do you want me to leave? Have I done something wrong? And they said, no, you're doing fine, but we forgot to get Home Office approval for your job. And I did traffic courts in the afternoon. And then about 5 or 6 months later, I shared an office with 3 older men who were in their late 40s, 50s. And I went back after my traffic court, and one of them was rubbing his arm. And I said to him, are you okay? He looked a bit grey and sweaty. And he said, oh, I've got this pain. I've got pins and needles in my arm and I've got a pain in my chest. So I dialed 999 for an ambulance. And he said, oh, I don't want to make a fuss. And I said, well, paramedics won't take you if you're well. Anyway, the next morning I was sent for by the clerk to the magistrates, who then told me that I had a job. And I was delighted and said, well, that's great. Why have I got a job now? And then he just said to me, oh, well, I'm afraid a colleague died last night. And I was very, very upset. And he kept saying to me, I don't know why you're crying, because you've got a job. And he didn't seem to appreciate that I've shared an office with this poor man for that time. And I knew that he had a wife and children. I then met somebody who wanted to go into planning law. He was a legal aid solicitor at the time. He needed to go and work for a local authority. There were no legal advisor roles in Cambridge where he had got a job. And I met the people that he had an interview with because I went for a day out. And they said they were looking for someone to do advocacy. And although I hadn't done my pupillage, I had done my bar exams, and they said that I could appear as an advocate for the local authority without that, with dispensation from the magistrates' court. So I agreed because they couldn't find anyone who wanted to do that work. So I prosecuted dirty restaurants. I gave advice to the Housing Benefit Tribunal, which I knew nothing about at all, but somebody in the office knew quite a lot about it and helped me out. And I also did Protection from Eviction Act proceedings. So I did that for a couple of years. I then was asked if I wanted to do some lecturing at the local further education college to Institute of Legal Execs. So I did that. In any event, after that, I then thought about how I could fund my pupillage, because there was no way I could save up enough money to really not get paid for a year, because I had rent to pay and everything else. So I discovered that if I could get some lecturing every night, and I just started covering anybody who didn't turn up, I covered their lectures. So I lectured to accountants, I taught company law, I taught employment law, I taught all kinds of things. And I realised that if I could get enough lecturing, I could do that. I could also clean for my landlord at weekends. So I managed to arrange 6 months pupillage in Cambridge at a local chambers, which was a good local chambers. I didn't tell them I was doing all this extra work, because you weren't supposed to have another job. You were meant to fund it yourself with a trust fund, I assume. I then did 6 months in London. We moved to London, and again, I cleaned for my landlord at weekends. I got lecturing. I taught a Silex course, correspondence course. I did marking for exams. I worked my socks off. I think every night I was lecturing somewhere, and I taught everything that nobody really wanted to teach. I taught export, import management law. I didn't even know there was a thing. I taught employment law to aero engineers. I taught anything nobody wanted to do, really. I think if you really want to do something hard enough, then you will really, really try. After that, I did a third 6 months of pupillage because I couldn't get a tenancy. I had 3 female solicitors who were prepared to brief me. The chambers I was in told me that I had a good chance of getting a tenancy because I had work. But the clerk said to me that they liked women, but the members of chambers didn't. And the members of chambers said to me, we like women, but the clerks don't. So I never really knew who was involved in all that. Things were very, very difficult. And I lived on an awful lot of vegetables. I go to the market on a Saturday with a bag and buy up all the vegetables that were being packed away right at the end of the day. They sell them for virtually nothing. And I was very, very good at making a lot of soup and baked potatoes and so on. But it was very difficult. I eventually got to the stage where I thought that I would get a tenancy because I had solicitors prepared to employ me. So that's one of the hardest things to do. And then one day I didn't have any work the next day, and I got a late brief in the morning, and I went to Westminster Magistrates Court to do my brief. And I met one of my instructing solicitors who was surprised to see me, and she said, oh, I tried to instruct you last night, but I was told that you were busy. She said, were you free this morning? And I said, well, I was until late this morning when I had a very late brief because somebody was ill. And she said, oh, well, your clerks are obviously trying to stop you working, which was quite difficult. And she said that she was going to make a formal complaint, and I didn't want her to because I thought it would just make things worse. But anyway, it was between me and another man, I think 2 other men, but they said that the men wouldn't go off and have babies. And because they hadn't agreed to abide by the Sex Discrimination Act, and I knew that I was better than both of them because I'd seen them both in court, and I'd had this advocacy experience at Cambridge City Council, and I wasn't brilliant, but I was absolutely fine. So I was very, very upset over that. The City University offered me a full-time lecturing job, so I became a university lecturer, but I really wanted to be a barrister. It's the only thing in my life I wanted to do. And although I loved lecturing in the sense that I really enjoyed the students, I found the academics really quite difficult. I did research for 2 of the big accountancy firms who offered me very lucrative jobs, but I didn't want to work for an accountancy firm. I wanted to be a barrister. So eventually I found somebody, he was setting up his own chambers, which was unheard of at that time. And I joined him because it was the only way I could think of getting in as a barrister. And then after I'd been with him for about 4 months, the solicitors I had were instructing me, so I was very busy. And I was in front of a judge at a county court who told me to wait behind after I'd done a 3-day trial in front of him. And I was very anxious because I'd never spoken to a judge, and he asked me to come and have a cup of coffee with him. So I thought, oh, it can't be too bad if he's asking me for coffee. And he said to me, I think you're very good. I've looked you up. So the judge said to me, right, well, I've phoned my old chambers. Tonight you're going to have an interview at 6 p.m. because I think you should join them. And I've told them they should take you on. They hadn't got any women in chambers. So away you go. And he was very, very kind. Without that kindness, I never would have got into the mainstream bar. And they offered me a tenancy just based on really what he had said and the fact I had a lot of work. It was quite funny, though, because they had no women in the chambers at all. So when we got our invitation to the Christmas dinner, which was in the Guards Club, because the head of chambers was a former guard, it said, you cannot bring your wives with you. And I assumed they meant my husband by then. And I went to the Guards Club for my first Christmas dinner as a member of chambers. I was very excited. I bought a new dress. And I went in and they said to me, I'm sorry, madam, you can't come in. We don't accept unaccompanied women. And I tried to explain to them that they wouldn't let my husband come to the party because it was limited people. And they just kept saying to me, no, you can't come in. We're not letting you in. And I got them to go and get somebody from upstairs to come down and vouch for the fact that I really was a barrister, because I kept telling them, they looked very dubious. And I said to them, look, this is my chambers party. I'm a barrister. And they kept saying, no, sorry, you can't come in. Anyway, somebody came downstairs and said, oh, yes, she's a barrister. She's a member of our chambers. So it was a very different time. And although it's still very difficult to get into chambers, at least I think there's more of a level playing field than there was then. But I have battled tirelessly over the years to try and help people who don't have the connections, who don't know anyone. I didn't come from that world. And I suppose I spent a very long time feeling like an imposter because I didn't go to bar school, so I didn't know people in quite the same way everyone else did. So I really feel for people who don't have these connections. I have tried my best to help people that I meet. People come and sit in with me. So after that, I think it was about 2001, I just decided I would do family work. So I did the first surrogacy case and I did the first forced marriage case. So I had a very enjoyable time as a barrister. My first husband left me and I met my second husband 3 years later, and he asked me why I wasn't a judge or a silk, a KC as they are now. And I said, oh, I don't really know because I've never really applied. And I looked at it and thought perhaps becoming a judge would be easier than becoming a silk, because I was worried about doing legal aid work and there being enough work for silks, because there were problems sometimes with people that applied for silk and then didn't get any work. And I was doing interesting work as I think they called us senior juniors. Only the bar could come up with that title. So I applied to be a judge. I can't read a form apparently, and I thought I was applying to be a part-time judge, and I actually ended up applying to be a district judge. I also applied to be a tribunal judge to do social security law, and I got an interview for the district judge. I went for the exam, as you had to do then. It's now all online, I think. And I was told by some very snotty people that actually you had to be a part-time judge first. And I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a go. I got through the exam, I got to the interview, and before the interview, I realised that you had to justify why you wanted to be appointed straight away. And the criteria said that you had to be exceptional in some way. And I said to my husband, well, I'm not really exceptional. And he said to me, darling, of course you are. You could do anything you want to do. You are exceptional. Think of something. And I thought back to my career, and he said to me, well, what judicial experience have you got? When have you been in court? And I said, well, as a barrister, but that won't count. And then I thought about my role as a legal advisor. And I said, well, I was a legal advisor and I did take traffic courts and I took directions hearings. And he said, oh, well, I'm sure that would be all right. So right at the end of my interview, when they said to me, why are you exceptional? Usually I probably would have said, well, I'm not really. If somebody else is exceptional, you should appoint them instead. But my husband is convinced that I should be running the Supreme Court, if not anything else. And he said to me, darling, go in positively, say you're exceptional and say why you're exceptional. So I said, yes, I am exceptional because I have had this experience as a legal advisor. But actually, it worked and they accepted that and said that would count. And on that basis, I became a district judge. And I also, in the meantime, became a tribunal judge part-time. So that was my career history, really. You never know when anything might come in handy. So I always say to people, any experience is good experience.
Just to touch on a few struggles that you mentioned, from gender inequality and being at a financial disadvantage and even being discouraged by people around you, I just wanted to know what kept you going to achieve your goals. What was like your mentality like?
Well, I suppose having done the job as a pupil barrister and having known that I'd got people willing to instruct me and knowing that I was as good as anyone. And I realised, having sat as a legal advisor, been in court, worked as a pupil barrister, that actually didn't matter what size you are, it's whether you can be heard and whether you're capable of getting people's interest. So I think I was just grimly determined. And also I had my late mother really wanted me to succeed, I suppose, because she'd had difficulties. Both my parents were very bright. They wanted the five of us. I had four brothers, so you learn to fight very early on. And I was the fourth out of five, so you've got more brothers to fight against. But certainly I think my mother said, if you're really determined to do something, if you really want to do it, you can do it. And that's very true, I think.
It definitely is. So, as you can imagine, a lot has changed over the years, especially when it comes to legal education and training. If you had your time again in 2023, is there anything that you would do differently?
I probably would have done an online course, which would have been very helpful, because the person that took the notes, if he'd had a night out the night before, didn't actually manage to make the lecture. So I'd had to fill in the gaps with books. So I didn't have any formal teaching. And so I think that would have been helpful, and somebody to ask would have been good as well, because I had no one to ask. I just had to look at past papers and try and work out what to do. But I had a big incentive to do it. If your salary is going to double, then you have that big incentive. So I think that's probably, I would have done an online course, I think.
So, as you're aware, there are various pathways to entering the legal system, whether that be solicitor, barrister, silex, or CLC license, conveyancer, or probate. However, the legal advisor route is not one that is commonly known. I can tell you from my own experience when I did my degree, literally, there were only two options. You either become a solicitor or a barrister once you graduate. So, I just wanted to find out from you personally, how important do you think the role of legal advisor is in the legal system?
It's really important. I think it's a very interesting role. I really enjoyed it, and I would have carried on doing it had there been a vacancy in Cambridge. It's only that I met somebody who offered me to do advocacy when I wanted to go to the bar, but it's a really enjoyable role. I've known legal advisors do it for a number of years and then go to the bar. I've known people stay as legal advisors. It's good in the sense that it's much more manageable if you want a family. The one thing about being a barrister was working at night because you always prepare your cases. Usually you get your papers quite late. So it's a more regulated role. It depends what you want your life to be like. I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was always interesting. There was never a dull moment. Never a dull moment.
Good. So I'm assuming so that people who've done the SQE route or wants to do the SQE route, they can qualify as a legal advisor after. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think they offer training contracts.
Great. So I'm interested to know what your views are on the SQE route. So for those who are listening, the SQE route is something that the Solicitors Regulation Authority introduced in 2021, which is a single national licensing examination for anyone who wants to qualify as a solicitor. This, of course, presents an opportunity for greater flexibility of study methods, so less costs, no LPC or training contracts required to qualify as a solicitor. So do you welcome the recent changes?
I do welcome the recent changes because I know that when I was at the bar, I was instructed by people who had been paralegals for a very long time. And it seemed to me entirely unfair that they were kept back because they were doing the work of a solicitor, but they just couldn't get a training contract. And so, under the new scheme, their work as a paralegal will work towards their qualification, so they don't have to do this 2-year training contract after they've done their exams. Any work they do, I think I can't remember if it's three organisations, but it will all count towards the 2 years. And I think it will stop people being exploited because I think a lot of people were held on sort of bits of string, being promised that they would be able to do their training contract and then not being given the chance. So I think it's a big move. Also, it's much cheaper and much more manageable. I don't know about the exam content because it's very different, I think. But certainly there are, what I've seen of something like the probate exam, it looks very practical and much more in line with what a solicitor actually does. So as far as I can see, it's a very good thing, and it will encourage people, I think, who don't have the funds, who can just go off and spend a year doing it. They can do it part-time. And I think it's a really, really good move, and it's to be welcomed because it will certainly widen the pool, I think, and widen the net for people that perhaps wouldn't think about doing it.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that the qualifying work experience can be gained in multiple organizations. To delve deep on this, it can be gained in up to 4 organizations, and this can be either paid or voluntary work and could include time spent in voluntary for a charitable organization or a law center or clinic. It can even include placements on a law degree. It doesn't even need to be gained in England and Wales, and it can be completed overseas. This truly is breaking down the barriers in the profession and allowing a greater opportunity for those aspiring to be a solicitor to meet the criteria to qualify. With regards to all the pathways to becoming a judge, would you say that they are sufficiently known about and accessible?
No, I've worked very hard with Silex doesn't have really an organisation in Kent, as far as I can see. And I have written to anybody I see in my cases who've signed it. I offer them a chance to come and sit in with me to talk about their career. I've had, I think, 5. I told the local law society president for Kent that I would encourage any solicitors who wanted to apply for judicial roles that I would help mentor them through the whole system, because it's certainly not about how good a lawyer you are, it's whether you can navigate the system, and it's all about showing that you have competencies and giving precise examples of what you have done as opposed to generalizations. So I've got 5 solicitors through to the final interview
That's great.
for Deputy District Judge, and I've got 1 through the recorder exercise. And last year I wrote the recorder. The recorder are part-time circuit judges, as opposed to deputy district judges who are part-time district judges. And I wrote the role play for that, and I sat on the interviewing panel so that it would give me a good understanding of what they were after. But I have been through district judge, tribunal judge, circuit judge, and then section 9, which is deputy high court judge competitions, and the designated family judge competition as well. So I understand what they want and how to do it, and it's really helping people who perhaps wouldn't think about it. I don't think I've ever had a male barrister who's told me this is not worthy, but most solicitors tell me they're not. And so I help them look at their strengths and weaknesses and really how to navigate the system. So hopefully, I'm fingers crossed, I've got those 5 through the competition. It's up to them on the day, but I've also approached academics. I'd help anybody at the law training centre who wanted to think about judicial appointment, because I think it's really important that we try and widen the pool of people that perhaps wouldn't think about it, because it is a really interesting job. I love it, actually. And I've told my husband I can carry on till I'm 75. And I think, what do they say? Judges don't retire, they just lose their appeal.
That's a good one.
There we are.
Yeah. So on that basis, would you say that anyone can become a judge? Like, are there any barriers that someone might face from a non-privileged background, perhaps?
No, we've certainly got a number of judges who don't. It's a kind of myth that they all come from these privileged backgrounds. Well, I think probably when I was younger, they all did, because you'd have to have a privileged background to do it, and there weren't many solicitors who became judges. Now it's much, much wider. And in fact, lots of people I know don't come from privileged backgrounds. And I think it probably makes you a better judge in the sense that you understand how life works.
Definitely. So what do you prefer about being a judge compared to advocacy?
The amount of holiday I get that's paid. My late mother used to tell me I should get a proper job, and I kept saying to her, but I'm a barrister. And she said, no, a proper job means that you're employed and you get sick pay, because as a barrister, you go to work regardless, really, if you're ill. It was just nice to have a day off and be sick on that day. I think that's the main difference. I probably still work. When I had COVID, I carried on my trial, but I sat at home and I was a judge from the neck up, really, on the video link, wrapped in a blanket the rest of the time. You don't have usually the same amount of work over the weekends or nights, but it's much rarer. At the bar, I worked every evening. So I think that's probably, and I probably worked all of Sunday. So I think that's probably the difference. The hours are much better and I get much better holidays.
Yeah. So are there any aspects of being a judge that you felt you were not prepared for, or that the prospective judge should be aware of before joining the judiciary?
As a judge, that I think you need to pace yourself. You deal with very sensitive, difficult things, depending on what kind of law you do. Certainly if you're doing crime or family, things can be very difficult. I think you have to accept that sometimes you're going to be upset about cases, but to a certain extent, we've all done this work as barristers or solicitors, so it's not a surprise. I think you just have to be kind to yourself. Actually, the other judges are very nice. We support each other. We're provided with professional support if we need it. We can have counselling if we need it, if we've done a particularly difficult case. But I think you just have to realise that at the end of the day, you can only do what you can do. But I think it's a really fascinating career, and I've loved being a judge. I've been a judge now for 10 years, and I could quite happily do it for another 10 years. I'll let you know.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today, Judge Sarah, and I'm sure that will be a real help to our learners and definitely will be useful for those who are looking to become legal advisors. To any of our listeners, if you would like further information, please feel free to contact Law Training Centre by sending an email to info@ltckent.co.uk or check out our website at ltckent.co.uk. Thank you.